This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, and the disclaimer, by attending this event, you consent to be recorded. And of course, we've notified Dan that the presentation will be recorded for posterity's sake and published to our training channel. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Martin, WB4S. I'm the training manager for Georgia AuxComm. Thank you for attending our August training. We've got a treat in store for you. But first, let's go through our agenda. So we're going to start with a little housekeeping, and then we're going to get right into our presentation. And then following the presentation, the Q&A, we'll have a slide with some more information on Georgia AuxComm and how to contact us and how to find more information about Georgia AuxComm. All right, so a little housekeeping. If this were a few years ago, we would have to go extensively through meeting etiquette for online meetings, but based on the pandemic, we're all fairly well versed in using online meeting software. GoToMeeting is no different. From a user perspective, you can raise your hand, you can type into chat, you can mute and unmute yourself. So we would ask if you have questions during the presentation, you can raise your hand, type them in chat, or I believe Dan will pause long enough to ask for questions periodically through the presentation. We do want to keep this interactive, and the questions and answers can range anything from the mundane to the very technical. We welcome all questions. If you have questions for Georgia AuxComm, anyone in the chat in the AuxComm organization can answer them, or you can ask them at the end during the Q&A period. All right, with that, I'd like to introduce Dan. Dan Wills is an IT specialist with CISA. He lives in Sedona, Arizona, and has had a very storied, might be the wrong word, but pretty incredible career. He served in several leadership positions, including communications coordinator for Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. He was a battalion chief for Sedona Fire District, worked as a park ranger law enforcement for the National Park Services, namely the Grand Canyon and Yosemite National Parks. His degree is from Northern Arizona University and Central Arizona College. And Dan was one of the incident commanders during the aftermath and response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So I'd like to welcome Dan and thank him for his time. And Dan, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and make you a presenter.
Sounds like somebody just got home from school.
There we go.
All right. There we go. Screen. Let's do that. Let me get this up on and see if this works.
You are live.
Okay. Well, thanks, Joe. The bio is mostly close, but it gets the big pieces. I spent quite a bit of time in law enforcement, but followed by 27 years I spent in the fire service, actually here in Arizona. In 16 days, we will be hitting the 20th anniversary of the attack on September 11th. I just absolutely have to, I'm amazed that 20 years has gone by. It does not seem that long. So I've got a series of slides here. I didn't put it in a formal presentation because that requires all kinds of nonsense by the agency. So got 70, 80 slides here we're going to run through. And what it's more than just, here's what happened 20 years ago. I want to have a conversation as we go along here and talk about what, this isn't what does it mean? We all analyzed this 10 ways a Sunday, but where have we come from here? This was actually a starting point for an awful lot of what we do in terms of emergency communications. So we'll chat about this along the way. This is going to be really informal. And like Joe said, I will stop from time to time and see if there are questions. If you have anything burning, I think you can raise your hand on this thing. I'm not sure. But we'll go through this. There's not a beaten order in this thing. but I think that you might find this interesting. So a little pretext to this, in September of 2001, I was serving on a Type 1 incident management team. There are 16 national Type 1 teams in the United States, and they're mostly fire teams. You know, they're built by land management agencies, and they're not just Forest Service or BLM or Park Service. They're actually interagency teams that comprise large parts of federal government, but also have lots of state and local actors in them. In the southern region where you are, there are two teams. There's a red team and a blue team. Those are the two Type 1 incident management teams that work the South. And they're made up of numerous state, federal, and local agencies around the southern United States. The Geographical Coordination Center is in Atlanta. Your closest cache of the national cache system is actually up in Kentucky. And New London, Kentucky. It sits up there. But anyway, so September 11th, I was on a wildfire in northern Montana. We were actually in Glacier National Park. It was called the Moose Fire. And I think it had about 50,000 acres running across the Flathead National Forest into Glacier National Park and up into Waterford Park into Canada. We'd actually crossed the border. So we'd been on this fire for 18 days. We're typically rotated out in 14 days. But then the morning of September 11th, I went into the comm tent is what we were operating out of. And one of my radio operators said, "Hey, look at this." And he had one of those little Casio televisions. And we had actually a TV signal from Columbia Falls, Montana there. And here's this picture of the first plane hitting. And like most people, I thought, is this a made for TV movie? And he goes, "No, it's the news." And it was like, So I started, making some calls and talking to people. And then all of a sudden, within a window of time, the second it hit. It was about an hour and a half after the second aircraft had hit, we got a phone call and communications on the fire. And it was from the FAA. And the FAA said, if you have anything in the air, land it and allow nothing to take off. We were just spooling up our operation in aviation for the day. We had 15 helicopters assigned to this fire and probably 7 or 8 air tankers. Air attack was already up and starting to, start the day. We put everything on the ground, and we also withdrew from the fire because we did not have the ability to safely support firefighters on the ground. So we pulled off of the fire and let it burn for a day until we had a little better idea of what we were doing. So it was odd on a good day. So all of a sudden they brought in a Type 2 incident management team to relieve us immediately. And so, I wake up in a tent in Glacier National Park, and within 24 hours, we're checking into hotels in Times Square. So they'd originally sent 4 Type 1 incident management teams to the East Coast. We were the first into Manhattan. The second went into New Jersey, the staged, and then 2 days they released them. The 2 that went to the Pentagon were released immediately because the DoD had the place locked down pretty tightly. So here we are, and there's still paper in the air when we arrive. The 62 people were traveling in our incident management team. This is a contract 737 flight out of Montana to the East Coast, and if you recall, there was no aviation in the air after the attacks. So we're on a particularly unique flight, and the flight also had a pair of F-16s, on each wing as we flew to the East Coast. So it was different. I would like to say that this was outside my experience, but coming to find pretty quickly it was outside everybody's experience. Nobody had dealt with an event like this. So a little bit when we walk through some of these things, you know, that yes, there's the, you know, the kind of inherent tragedy of what occurred in this thing. But in terms of AuxComm, I want you to look at this and think about this on a little more tactical, a little more granular look. And we'll be stopping along the way here and see, you know, what are those things that we learned out of this, and what started from all of this. Interoperability wasn't new. It didn't have the energy and the thrust behind it, but we'd already knew from the Murrow bombing in Oklahoma City, and for a while that obviously we were too siloed up. Our systems were so tightly protective that we did not know how to talk well to one another. That's not saying it didn't happen. There's some places that have had this down forever out of necessity, and there are other places that still exist today that are a little more kind of feudal territory. So, okay, so this is from the south side, looking up towards the pile in southern Manhattan. This is 16 square acres of property, and it had everybody, you know, looks at the two towers, but there are actually 8 buildings in this complex, and all of them are destroyed. The two towers being the most notable. This is at the base. So again, we're on the south side. This is the base of 216 million pounds of building. If you look up in the top of the picture here, you'll see there are actually people up there poking around, and this was a great picture that gives you an idea of the scale of what was here. I took this picture from the roof. There's a fire station across the street, and it's called Ten House, and it was built for the Trade Center. It's not one of the old New York stations. It was actually built because of the Trade Center. And so this is from one of the second floor decks of the fire station. So, all right. But like I said, it gives you a sense of scale. And this goes on for 16 square acres. This pile was on fire from the moment it fell, and the final fire didn't actually go out for probably maybe 2 months. The fires were continuing to burn in the structure here. So I need to still lose weight here. But this was, you've never seen so much heavy equipment in your life. And that is one of the hazards, you know, when we get into these things, you know, and especially in disaster management, where we have hurricanes and flooding and all these things, that this heavy equipment's around, we're in proximity to this stuff. And, you know, I promise you that Komatsu there, when it backs up, if it backs up over you, the driver won't know. It won't even raise a track. So you really, really have to watch out for one another and have a whole different sense of awareness when we're in these disaster environments. This is, you know, an example of just the blast, okay, of all the debris and dust and everything else that was blown into these buildings, blew out all the windows. The change in the ambient air pressure was enough certainly to blow out windows all around. If you look at the bottom of the picture, you see these two Hanyaks down here who didn't seem it was important to have hard hats on. That's natural selection in action there. But this was kind of the case, and these walls are, you know, red brick, and they look like they've been sandblasted. And that's the entire perimeter of that. This is one of the few places where actually the part of the building fell forward. Both those buildings came down, you know, in an axial collapse. You know, it's not like the thing tipped over like a tree. There was this one piece here that did, you know, fall out to the side and crashed into the American Express structure there. But it actually, they were incredibly efficient in getting roads built around this complex pretty early on, and getting things to where, you know, that the rescue and recoveries could start being managed. I was really stricken on how quickly they were able to do that. Air quality in terms of just dust in the air was kind of crap for quite a while, but we were getting air assay tests every day in terms of what was in the particulate count and things like that. So they were doing pretty good at doing the best you could to just keep you safe. So there's a lot. And again, unless you go to the heavy equipment show in Las Vegas, you know, where you've got 40 cranes in the air, you'll never see an accumulation of big cranes that were brought to bear. You know, some of these showed up in a couple of days, and some of them took, you know, 2 and 3 weeks to show up. But a lot of heavy steel. This was in the media that oh, you know, this was a natural event, and no, it wasn't. This was the Steelworkers Union that managed to, you know, cut this off and make a cross out of it. So there was nothing magical about this, but it was a summary thing. You know, what people ask, you know, oh, you know, was it terrible? No, not really. You know, it's not like there are bleachers full of us sitting down there going, oh my God, everybody's working. And you find that in most disasters. You really don't get, you know, you don't swell up with the enormity of what's going on because you've got work to do, you know, and if you're not working, you're sleeping. And so everybody was engaged. This is much, the environment was much like a big commercial fire. You know, it smelled like a big commercial fire. You know, it was a big commercial fire, and, you know, in addition to all the other components of it. But no, actually, you know, in one context, it was probably more frustrating to the people who weren't there. The people who weren't there had this tremendous sense of futility of wanting to do something. We got to go work. We actually got the better end of the deal. So not what people think. A lot of collateral damage to buildings that surrounded the trade center here. And so there's a lot of work that had to be done early on to do structural integrity to figure out, are these buildings sound? You know, or do we have to worry about one of these other buildings coming down? And they all were, but that was, you know, an early concern. But you'll notice, you know, all the windows blown out of this thing. It was raining glass for about 6-7 days until they started getting netting up on all these buildings. And so, you know, the hazard level is high. This is that fire station I was telling you about, 10 House. And the FDNY has a crew of full-time sign painters, as it turns out. And, you know, so they painted themselves you know, a sign saying that we're still here. 2 of the 3 shifts working out of 10 House were killed, with the exception of a couple of people on leave. This occurred in the morning. It was happening during shift change. So both shifts were there in the station when this occurred. So that was, we worked out of another fire station up by City Hall, which we'll show you in a bit. But this was, nobody joked, everybody was somber as hell, you know, in this particular station. So when you did have work to do at 10 House, you got in, you got out. So this is typical, and you guys will see this around when you're in, you know, when you're in a hurricane or flood or tornadoes. If a task force has searched a building, then they'll go ahead and mark it up. This is California Task Force 1, which is Los Angeles County Fire Department. When they searched it, and when that they did search it, and then when. And so they don't have to, you know, go back over and over. So you'll see this in a number of different buildings as they move along. So this was called the Green Door. Actually, it was a restaurant across the street. The owner got it opened up and decided, you know, that there was a lot of food there. You know, the Red Cross had kitchens out, and McDonald's had trucks there, and everything you expect. But this was a pretty upscale restaurant, and the owner decided, yep, we're going to open. And they did, and it was incredible food. And he opened the thing, just out of his own pocket to make sure that everybody was taken care of. Again, that damage that we're constantly looking for. This is a marble building in Wall Street, and you go spray paint a marble building in Wall Street today, you get arrested. But in order to communicate what's where and how we do things, you do it with a rattle can. So, like I said, it was outside everybody's experience. This was new ground for everybody, and interesting. So they had FDNY was not engaged in ICS at that point. They were still using the old Fireground command system, so they had sectors, and they had a sector post on each side of the pile. And Vesey Street, West Street, all 4 streets had one of these, and it was kind of a coordination center of what was going on. You'll see all the plywood on the ground there. As quick as we could lay cables, people were trenching through them. We had a terrible time trying to keep communications going. Verizon, who is not only a cell carrier, but they are the wireline carrier in Manhattan, had a crew of 500 people to restore copper and another 500 people restoring fiber optics. They had a massive, group trying to just get basics involved. The core transformers for the power in that part of Manhattan, guess where they were? They were in the basement, as was the central office for all of Southern Manhattan. So many of the wireless carriers were on the trade center. So we kind of had nothing. We had what we brought, and Nextel actually had, oddly enough, had some sites surrounding the trade center where we were able to light some services up. But it took quite a while actually to get any kind of cellular presence, and the copper presence had gone south quickly. So we were running like crazy to just try and keep up some basic needs to support the incident. You'll see all this plywood sheeting on here. This is again covered where they didn't have the orange plastic. They do this to try and get a handle on all this glass that was just constantly raining. Parking. The city of the New York FDNY lost, I believe, 95 to 100 engines and ladders in this event. You start thinking of 100 ladders and engines. That's pretty significant. I'll show you some more here. Here's one of the ladders that was trashed. This is the urban search and rescue teams. We had a lot of dogs. And one of the things, Javits Convention Center, which is where most of the USAR teams were staged out of, which is just down the block on the Hudson River. At night, they'd have rolling office chairs and have dog races with all the search dogs. So the dog on the right, the lab on the right belongs to the Puget Sound Task Force 1, which is Seattle. And the chocolate lab on the left is belonged to Phoenix Fire. And he died about 10 years ago, I think. I actually kept track of that dog. So, but lots. We had, if you're familiar, we have DMATs, VMATs, and DMORT teams that are organized, and you see the DMATs on the news every day right now, the disaster medical assistance teams. And they're a group of typically 40 to 50 physicians, nurses, and paramedics that provide the disaster services, and they're being deployed for COVID right now all over the country again. We had 3 shifts of DMATs in Southern Manhattan working 24 hours a day. Nobody died after the original event in terms of being involved in the rescue or anything else. But nobody talks about the 200 injuries a day that were occurring, with this rescue operation. So VMAT is the veterinary medical assistance teams, and these are veterinaries and vet assistants. And we had 2 shifts of VMAT just taking care of search dogs. And then the DMORT, or the disaster mortuary units. And these are the morticians and medical examiners and pathologists. And they were the ones dealing with all of the fatalities involved. And that was a major operation. We had an entire warehouse set up as a morgue. We end up, and it's like, well, who do you support in terms of communications? Yes, you support everybody. You know, we ended up having to make, you know, do a lot of things to make sure we had good comms for those folks, you know, in the morgue, and that we're doing these mortuary unit things. So you don't think about a lot of these things that are behind the scenes, but they exist, and they all require some level of coordination. So this next shot here, this is an NYPD patrol car, lights and siren going code 3 through one of the checkpoints. And so if you ever wonder where priorities are, you know, there you are. So I think there's 200 pounds of dog food in the back of that puppy. So questions so far? Okay, so it was just an incredibly surreal place. One of the things that gets discussed a lot is, well, who's in charge? You know, what was the incident management structure like in this thing? And surprisingly, nobody. Somebody said, well, the mayor of New York is, and everyone goes, okay, fine. But nobody was really dealing with the mayor of New York. All of the different components of this thing kind of got together and got to work. And everybody stayed out of each other's way, and there was a lot of on-the-ground coordination going on. The Army Corps of Engineers were heavily engaged. The U.S. Coast Guard was heavily engaged because of all the hazmat component. We were there as an incident management team. The NYPD, the FDNY, the FDNY is probably a big lift. Huge components of construction involvement, obviously, in terms of trying to disassemble this morass of steel. So a lot of people involved, and the coordination was surprisingly at pretty low levels and surprisingly worked. I often think that, yeah, how would we have done with a big incident management system? And I'm not sure in New York it would have. And we also had the New York National Guard in play. You know, those running security on everything. So unusual. You saw people that you didn't expect. This was early on, and it's like, why is there a U.S. Marshal here? And why are there Secret Service people floating around here? Well, guess what? They had offices in those towers and those other buildings, buildings 7 and 8 notably. That we had a ton of federal agencies that had leased office spaces in these things. And so, yeah, they were there. The FBI was there. The FBI was actually, they have had times where they're different to deal with. They were actually spot on and incredibly forthcoming and easy to work with, which had not always been our experience to that point. But a lot of agencies you didn't expect coming out of the woodwork in this place, and everybody pitched in, got to work. But this is what it looked like the next day in terms of it was like snow, literally like snow. So again, the lots of apparatus damaged. As you see with most of these kind of events, they're kind of magnets for celebrities. This is Diane Sawyer at Javits, the convention center where USAR was. And I'll give them all credit. They were actually very respectful and worked very hard to stay out of everybody's way. This is Frank McCarthy. He was one of my cohorts in crime here. Frank is a captain with the Los Angeles County Fire Department, and if there was a camera, a Frank and a celebrity, they would all coalesce for an opportunity. Credentialing, you see around Frank's neck here, was a bit of an issue. We finally got FEMA USAR credentials issued to us, plus a number of others. I think my credential pack here's got like 5 cards on it. The red card, and you can't see the face of it, the red card is actually that if you're going to be working at ground zero, you had to have the red card, and they're all personally signed by Rudy Giuliani. So it kind of weird. But Frank, there were actually 3 of us working as a team. Mike Hanneman from the U.S. Forest Service, myself, and Frank from LA County. The president stopped by, and I will give him credit. He didn't wave to the crowd. He dove right in and talked to everybody personally. So that was worthwhile. That meant a lot to people. You're trying to assess radio coverage. How do you cover the concrete canyons? How do you cover a piece of terrain you're not used to? I'm sure not. I mean, give me a mountain range and I'm all over it. But Manhattan's a little outside my experience. So, we can do propagation all day long and the computerized guesses, but it's not telling you what you need to know. And so there are times that you want to get in the air and see what you're dealing with, and start developing some strategies on what works. We learned a lot. Things we thought we knew. Some of it we were guessing with, and I'll show you some of the examples of that as we go. But we learned quite a bit. This is terrain. A lot of times we consider in the radio world buildings as clutter. They're surface clutter. But in these kind of environments, this is terrain. These are concrete canyons. And we treat these more like mountains than we do typical RF clutter. So there's Frank. The guy who's lived in Bridge Outwood, he's also with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. So lots of damage.
I have a question for you.
Sure, you bet.
So, as you were going through and talking about the canyons, explain kind of the propagation side from VHF to UHF to 7/800, and maybe why they were on UHF versus 7 or 8 or VHF.
Great question. So one of the things you stop and you look at, and you're on one side of this, like I said, 216 million pounds of building that's probably 150 feet tall, if not maybe taller. How do you talk to the other side of that? How do I talk to somebody on the ground on the other side? And it's like, well, we're obviously we put repeaters up right away, but we also started testing some other things. Well, how about simplex? You can't simplex, really? Because you're in a concrete box. And remember some of the basics about radio waves bouncing? You know what? The simplex wasn't 1,000%, but it was not what people thought. Everybody thought that this isn't going to happen, and that wasn't true. So, in terms of bands, we use VHF a lot in the wildland arena, so it's purely for propagation, and we get a little better penetration into a lot of these kind of areas. 800 on the other side of this thing has every band has attributes, and every band has warts. And 800 in building coverage for a whole host of reasons we can talk about all night has some advantages. So you kind of figure out what works. And at the end of the day, and I got some slides towards the end here. At the end of the day, well, how do you know? That's easy. You test it. You take it out for a walk. You try it out. And things that you think should work don't. And things that you think would never work do. And so, all the radio propagation in the world will never, ever replace walk testing. Get the stuff on the air. And it's not like, you set up a portable repeater and it chunk, oh, that's good. No, that's not good. That told you nothing. All right. You need to test it on the air to people that are in the theater of operations, in the ground, on the place where you're trying to cover. Kerchunk is nothing. You can take the antennas off the portable and off the repeater, and you're still going to kerchunk. So, the FDNY had ended up they're in a band called T-band. Most state and local public safety is in the UHF, that's in UHF, is in the 450 to 470 range. The federal government is down below from about 380 to 450. But spectrum was so tight, as you might imagine, in New York, they had nowhere to go. And so they occupy what's called the T-band. And the T-band in UHF is 470 to 512 megahertz. So it actually started with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office that petitioned the FCC in the 60s. They said, we have no spectrum. We can't grow. We're in trouble. And they petitioned the FCC to vacate UHF channel 13, which was a 5 meg wide television channel who was out of business in LA. And the commission approved it. And they said, yes, we'll allow you to divide that into radio channels. And GE and Motorola, the major vendors at the time, said, hey, we'll make equipment for it. So that was the start of T-band. And the next day, New York was all over it. Boston was all over it. You saw it on the coast. You saw it in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and you see it on the East Coast. So what's New York used now? T-band. They are still, both FDNY and NYPD are huge legacy operators of T-band, and frankly, they just rebuilt it here not too long ago. So it's not like an old bunch of vintage stuff. One of the things I learned down in West Virginia with dealing with some of the people in the mines, I said, what propagates well in a mine? Because that's, going to be some of the same conversations you have about subway tunnels and things like that. And UHF is oddly the winner in that one. That being said, nothing travels well very far, even with power. But, UHF has a slight edge over the other. So different bands for different things. You're more likely going to be stuck with what you have. And so then it's a matter of figuring out, okay, how do we make this work? But we had VHF, UHF, 700 and 800 to a lesser extent, but most of this was a VHF and UHF engagement. Does that help?
Most certainly. Thank you.
Okay. So, like I said, lots of vehicles. Let me back up on that. So you lose 100 engines and ladders out of your fire department. How long does it take to replace that much rolling stock? Any guesses? It took 3 days. That's how big the reserve fleet is for the FDNY. This is an organization with 800 battalion chiefs. I mean, the scale of this agency is like nothing I've ever seen. And we'll talk a little more about some of the things that they learned, because there were some pretty nasty lessons that they picked up along the way. And I think we're going to come back to this picture, but this is 20 floors up, looking down into the pile. And what is, is there something here that's of value to us? And we're going to talk about this. If you get somebody to agree that this isn't a crime scene, and we were tripping over that all the time, based on the investigations going on, we'll come back and talk about this window 20 floors up. It's up above here. And I said, these are marble walls that look like they got sandblasted. And it took quite a while to get sheeting over these things, because to stop the, the constant glass assault. But these are U.S. Forest Service, what we call FOBs, field observers, and they typically will go around looking for fire behavior. And they weren't quite. We put them in the subways, and these guys were lost for days. These are typically the yokels among the Gothamites. They really didn't have city skills whatsoever. So we managed to get them, glued into where the pastrami was and everything else. But they were a little lost for a while. So again, this kind of heavy equipment. Show you. Well, let me back up here. This stuff will back right over you, and the operator will never know it. Nobody will hear you scream. And this isn't just ground zero. This is, all of these kind of major disaster events that we're engaged in, and we're out there. We're doing an AuxComm mission, or or doing any 100 things, you have the opportunity to be in front of some of this stuff. And like I said, there's nobody there looking after you. So you really have to have a much heightened sense of awareness around you. Many times people getting ferried into the pile was simply done by crane. We'd actually looked at using one of these for a repeater, but quickly decided against it. Most of the public safety fatalities were the FDNY and the Port of New York Authority police, but there were a handful of NYPD officers killed. Weirdly, NYPD handles the vehicular rescue in the city. The fire department doesn't. So if you have a wreck that requires a hearth tool, these special service units from NYPD show up. Well, by the nature of the incident, they showed up, and they lost a number of NYPD officers there. This is looking down the street, and this isn't the Trade Center. This is building 7 and 8. Remember I told you there are a number of different buildings and complexes in that 16 square acres, and they and most of them burned or came down, but there was a lot more than just the Trade Center itself. Again, watching for structural damage. But one of the things when we run Comtext through this, it's like, what else do you have here? What's that? Is this stable? Is this secure? Okay, can you get out there? Right? You might have just picked yourself a good repeater spot. And we'll talk about, good ideas and bad ideas in terms of where you might consider assets. And I said, signage was done with a paint can. That's just how business was done. This is building 7. Obviously, a lot of these were unstable, and they were just a matter until they could get pulled down and wrecked out. So, this was I forget which engine this is, but this is a Type 1 fire engine. One of the things, and one of the big lessons I think we took out of this was there were another number of engines that were assigned to this incident. There were a number of engines that weren't. It was like, hot damn, there's something going on in southern Manhattan. They jumped in the engine and went. Self-dispatch, and they got there in time to die. I think it's really a graphic lesson of wait till you're called. That self-dispatch is something we talk about. We talk about in AuxComm. We talk about in everything we talk about. In that, not only are there all kinds of repercussions of being ill-informed when you take off, but you get 10 miles down the road and you realize, oh, we should have brought X because the mission required it, and you just left it in your garage. But this was, like I said, a graphic example, a lot of that kind of damage. So there are people down in here. The picture doesn't show it, but we've got dogs and USAR people down in these collapse areas here, really looking for, they recovered a couple of people after the first day, but after that, there was nothing. People had this odd notion of, I don't know, people, hiding out in an encapsulated Starbucks in the subway tunnel or something, and it just wasn't the case. If you thought about just the pure physics of this, the change in ambient air pressure of a collapse like that, certainly enough to kill most people. So, this is Duane Street, and oddly, the stations have numbers, but they don't use them. They're done by where they are. 10 houses on 10th Street there. This is Duane Street, which is right down the block from City Hall. And it's a 3-story fire station. There's one of my control stations we put up there on the roof. It's an old New York fire station. It in the back of it, it still has stables for the horses. That's how old the station is. And yes, they have, there are 4 poles in this fire station that go all 3 floors. And yes, that's kind of cool. But an old fire station, we took over, the incident management team took over a lot of the top floor, and we ended up staging our operations out of here. It's about 4.5 blocks out of Ground Zero. And one of the Engine 7, this is Engine 7, Ladder 1, Battalion 1 work out of here. And if you recall any of the news, there was an engine there at Ground Zero when this thing happened. And it was Engine 7. Ten House was doing something else. And they were down there with a photo shoot with some French film crew. And so when this happened, they were the first ones in the door. And the battalion chief, really neat guy, they were first in there, and they also realized this was bad, and they got out. So everybody in Ten House survived this when the other station lost almost everybody. The battalion chief, I worked with him for quite a while. I didn't realize that he had a brother that was later killed there. That I had no idea day to day that this guy had lost a brother in the collapse. So pretty amazing, resilient group of people. This was our plans chief, actually, that one of the success stories of this thing was bringing an incident management team into New York is unusual. New York is big enough that they don't send anybody out, and they sure never had anybody come in. They're very isolationist. They were big enough where they felt they were self-sufficient. And so here's an incident management team from Arizona and New Mexico, of all places. They all consider we work for the Forest Service, although that wasn't true. And who are these guys? Well, number one, we didn't show up in full uniforms and saluting and things like that. We were pretty low key. We were very low key. And so Paul Sommerfeld here actually started a relationship with our plans people and said, hey, can we help you with a couple of things? And it came in a real low profile. And in a period of a few days, we were fully adopted by the FDNY. They realized we knew how to do things that they didn't have a handle on. That fire department fights some of the most ungodly, heroic, fires in the world, but they don't do anything that lasts more than 2 or 3 days. You can burn a high rise to the ground in 2. So it was very apparent they did not know how to do long-term large incident management, like campaign fires where we're on them for months at a time. And so we kind of became their best friends. And it was the female, all kinds of people noted, like, who are these guys that FDNY all of a sudden likes? And so we ended up, we're typically in a rotation for 14 days, and another incident management team will relieve you so that you don't get beat up with fatigue. The powers that be said, who's the next team after Arizona? And they said, well, actually, it's this California team. And they went, oh, no. Those are a bunch of saluting devils that are, they're not going to keep this relationship going well. So they asked us, would we stay another rotation? Okay, so now we're at 28 days. And no, we were longer there than anybody. Who's the next rotation? Alaska. Yeah, that's okay. Alaska's a bunch of good old boys like us, and they're real low key. We work with them a lot. But even when we brought Alaska down after 28 days, they said, we want you guys to shadow Alaska for 7 or 8 days to make sure that all the relationships you've built transfer. And so anyway, we were 34 days on site. We were there longer than anybody else and left it in the hands of the Alaska team going out, and that worked out well. A lot of large incidents, we will, on big fires, we'll go out and lease, 7 or 8 of these things just for the utility of a base camp. They said, no, just go buy them. So we went and bought about 20 of these things. And brought them in the next day. They had big FDNY stickers on them. Okay. And then all of a sudden they all vanished. And then they showed up again a couple days later, and they all had red paint jobs and FDNY stickers on them. So yeah, we didn't lease these. They ended up staying. Whoops, back up there. This is our incident commander right here, incredibly dialed guy. So here's ground zero down here. And so think about this from the radio aspect, not like, oh my God, it's, no. Think about, what do you got here? You have secure sites. Do you want to put, let's say you're going to stick a 2-meter repeater out here, a 70-centimeter repeater. You want to be up here on the 80th floor of one of these buildings, okay? A little bit of gain, you'll be covering New Jersey just fine, but you're not going to talk down here in your area of operations. So that's why I brought up that 20th store window. Is there a place there for simply to hang an antenna out a window? And is that going to provide better coverage there than you are getting on top of these high rises? The other thing that happens in high rise buildings is you got a noise floor over a city like this that's horrendous. So all of a sudden being down low is a much tastier option. So we had a lot of opportunities for places when everybody was saying, oh, put it on the tallest place. That's the last place you want to be. So, there's some of those you consider. And is it going to work? Don't know. Get it up there and turn it on and try it. Get it on the ground and test it. And I keep reiterating, there is no substitute for on the ground testing. That oh, this will work fine. Don't bet on it. Just too many karma, phase of the moon, all kinds of variables out there. So there's some cameras the Department of Energy out of Savannah River actually coughed up, so we could have people watching the pile, and there's somebody watching 24 hours a day, scanning that pile to make sure somebody isn't getting in trouble. This is the actual deck on the 10-house fire station. So that's yours truly. The guy on the right actually came down from the Alaska team, and Jeff Keener, really great guy. Yeah, he had his mouth open for a few days because, again, these are people living in less than urban settings. So, this is the flight deck of the USS Intrepid, anchored in the Hudson River there, and the FBI had taken it over early on, but we needed to have a repeater site that was low, that was secure, because we needed to coordinate activities on these warehouses that were currently on the Hudson River. The morgue was in one of them. The state set up its EOC since it was damaged in one of them. We had a number of different activities going, so we needed a place to coordinate that. It's like, huh. So up we go. Probably the first and last time I'll be on the top mast of an aircraft carrier, but it ended up sufficing our needs just fine. We ended up with we put one of the national cache Daniels repeaters up there on VHF. And VHF had a UHF link in it as well. But up it goes, and trying, these things are all battery powered. You go back in every 6-7 days and change batteries on them. Nobody ever wants to help the tech change batteries until it's in a cool place. Then everybody wants to help. So, and there it is. That's the mast for that thing, and that served us throughout the entire event. Again, trying not to try and be the highest one on the block, trying to find out what is the most practical elevation to be in. So do I want to be on a 100-foot tower, or is that 4-story Marriott over there, or Courtyard Inn? Is that a possibility? So when you start thinking about siting things, you start really getting a feel. Drive around your own community going, where are potential places that if everything came apart would end up being a suitable radio site for me? Those are things that we really, not having done this work in a major metro like this and then getting stuck in the major metro, we were learning 100 miles an hour. It was actually pretty intriguing. Coast Guard had an armed presence on the water. You don't see the Coast Guard Boston whalers with the M250 heavies on them, in civilian waters very often. But even the NYPD boats were. We had a pretty heavy armed presence everywhere you went. This is Javits, the convention center where all our USAR teams were staged out of. And this is One Penn Plaza. It was one of the original buildings we looked at, saying, because it looked down this to the left here into ground zero. And so several of the USAR teams looked at this initially as a good spot. And so when you're looking at one of these, you look around the city and you go, oh, that's the spot where all those antennas are. Yeah, that's the worst spot. You know, these antenna farms that are either on mountains or on, you know, big buildings typically have RF noise floors that are untenable. Well, it's got to be the best spot. Not necessarily. It may be the only building where the architect allowed it, or, you know, where they would allow commercial leases. And there are all kinds of things that go into what goes on to what building. So this one got looked at, and it's not bad. Had very little RF, a couple of microwave shots, and these train tracks are on the top are for these carriages they lower down for the window washers. But so we had a lot of steel to lash antennas and things like that too. But at the end of the day, we ended up moving a lot of those repeaters closer to ground zero on some of those kind of wedding cakes I showed you in buildings before, and ended up not using this. We then got handed a mission that we need to coordinate resources between the Hudson River and the East River, which are, you know, an eternity beyond, you know, with the city in between. And so now we had to go hunt a high site. We really worked hard to stay off of the skyline in New York because of obvious reasons. So, yeah, all right, well, where are we going to go? Let's go here. So this is the 81st floor of the Empire State Building. We were offered, there are actually, well, believe it or not, offices up here. We were offered space on here, but this is AM broadcast that was still live on top of this thing. And we wanted to be as high as we needed to do to get the mission done, but we did not want to be the highest people in town. So there's no door going out here. You have to crawl out a window to get onto this deck. And unlike the tourist one up above, there's no screens or anything else for doing this. You know, trying to leap with a single bound, that didn't work out. Everything, you know, long before September 11th was secured, the dogs went through everything. Yes.
Hey, Dan, just a 3-minute warning. Giving you a heads up. We have about 3 minutes left.
All right. So anyway, on to the 81st floor. If you're acrophobic, maybe this isn't the job for you. But it worked. You know, again, it's a VHF tactical repeater. We got up there in a very simple setting. I borrowed a spectrum analyzer from the FEMA team, and wow, yeah, there's a lot of reasons you don't want to be on these sites. So these look like Art Deco elements here. They're actually VHF dipoles for television. Beautiful old building. So that ended up there. This is one of those things where we started testing. Okay, what works and what doesn't work in these kind of environments. So we find that you may be better off in one of these low buildings and a whole lot better off than you are in a high building, and you're really covering nothing unless you have a specific mission. So windy up there. These are the Daniels repeaters that come out of the National Cache. The roof of Madison Square Gardens, you know, the cabs give you perspective on size. Some of these buildings were gorgeous. This is the Western Union building. This is where the first transatlantic cable was struck from here to Ireland, from New York to Ireland. And we were down in the cable vaults of this thing. We did end up using some infrastructure on top of buildings, but you want to make sure people know you're there. Let people know, especially the division supervisors, that you're going to be in an operational area for this kind of stuff. This is looking down, why we picked it. Because if you don't announce your presence, you might find somebody coming to see you who doesn't know why a bunch of strange people are on a building top. So make sure you let people know where you are and what you're doing. Corps of Engineers, I'll work with these people any day. They're some of the most organized people I've ever been around. FEMA, these are FEMA MERS teams. You know, we finally set up microwave to get across ground zero because they kept trenching all the cables we put down. So this is the Verizon building. These are 500 pair of telephone cables trying to restore services coming out of there. If you remember, the second plane went in, it looked like something flew forward. Those were turbine jet engines that flew forward and went into the Verizon building there. So last two here. This is a technician that worked for Verizon, and he was with us for a few days, and I said he wanted to borrow some tools. I said, sure. Where are your tools? You know, and these old Bell guys, you know, they have these ancient leather pouches that have morphed to their legs, and I said, where are your tools? He goes, oh, I missed my tools. What's up? He was in building 2 when this thing hit. He worked in the central office and they were watching it on TV. And I said, why'd you end up leaving? He goes, because TV went out. He'd been there 8 days. And so we said, you know what? You need to go home for a little bit. Great guy, great guy. So this is not fog. This is smoke. So much we learned in terms of RF, in terms of organization, in terms of don't be afraid to try things that seem impractical. If you don't know how to do something, ask. Count on relationships and build new ones. You know, that this was the start of it. You know, 2005, 3 years later, the HSPD5, you know, the putting the incident management system in place occurred. And that started an awful lot of stuff in motion. Everything we've done in terms of all hazard, CommL, CommT, the AuxComm program, all of these things, you know, took a root off of this one day in September. 20 years, 16 days from now. So questions?
All right, if you have questions, please come off mute and ask Dan your questions.
Dan, how long from when you first got there to where you were providing comm? And you touched on this a little bit, but I take it that your setups were never static? In other words, were you improving and changing locations and your setups all the time?
So originally, you know, that most of these national cache assets we travel with are built to be, you know, put up with, you know, people with boxing gloves and Leathermans. You know, they're incredibly simple and they go up incredibly fast. And you know, you'd cringe to think it's a permanent installation, but we tape these things, we glue them, we do everything necessary to get them on the air. USAR was in right away. They already got some of the infrastructure up. You know, we came in and it took a couple of days to get things in. Donkeyed with stuff a little bit, but by and large, once we got some sound rules down on what we were trying to cover, and part of that is knowing the mission. What are you trying to do? You know, you're not trying to cover the whole incident. You may be trying to cover a geographical area. You're not trying to cover all of Manhattan. So knowing what the mission is allows you to fine tune and adjust these things. And if you're finding something isn't working, and then you know, look at an alternative and go test it. Okay, before you know, the hopscotch a bunch of stuff around, because you'll end up with a down period, you know, when you're moving equipment. We're lucky to have duplicates of stuff, but yeah, you know, it really takes, it's really worth taking some time to think through where you want to place some of these resources. But that's something you can do in the morning when you're driving around. Look at your own community and going, what are potential spots that if everything, you know, came unglued? And like I said, there are times where that 4-story Courtyard Inn may be the, you know, the absolute schnizzle for a radio site. So anyway.
Great question. Any other questions? All right.
Anybody
Well, first
else?
and foremost, Dan, thank you for that. That was an amazing presentation and a great perspective on September 11th. And you know, till you hear it, you don't really realize it's been that long, right? It's still fresh in a lot of people's minds.
That's amazing to me, you know, and it, yeah. What's not in my bio, by the way, is I'm K7RUF, and appear on HF from time to time. So.
Oh, awesome. All right. Let me go ahead and get through the announcements, and then at the very end of this, if there are any additional questions, we can keep going. So our next training will be September 30th. The topic is to be announced. So watch our Facebook, groups.io, and our newsletter for the invitation for that. And here's how you can find more information on Georgia AuxComm. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We have a training channel on YouTube, our website, and our groups.io page. Honestly, if you just search for Georgia AuxComm in Google, one of these sites will come up. So with that, again, Dan, thank you for this fantastic presentation. And I'm going to end the recording here. And if anyone has additional questions, we'll go ahead and allow you to do those.